In the very heart of the sun-scorched land of Castile, far away from the salty winds that caressed the shores of its vast empire, a grand palace was rising, a structure that was to serve not merely as a residence for a monarch, but as a stone embodiment of a single individual's soul and ambitions. This edifice, called Escorial, was conceived as a hybrid space, part monastery, part mausoleum, and part command centre for the entire world. Its austere, unadorned granite walls seemed to absorb within themselves the very essence of unwavering faith and severe austerity, reflecting the spiritual strength and unshakable conviction of its creator. Here, within the quiet of its chambers that resembled the cells of a monk, rather than luxurious dwelling for a ruler of half the known world, sat a man whose name alone could make kings and popes tremble. Philip II, King of Spain, Portugal, Naples and Sicily, Duke of Milan, ruler of the Netherlands and the Aormian lands, the territories where the sun never set, commissioned this symbol of his divine mission. His face, frozen like a death mask, revealed no emotion. Only in his deeply set, pale eyes, hidden beneath heavy brows, flickered a cold fire, an unyielding blaze of fanatic faith intertwined with imperial ambition. Before him lay a massive oak table, cluttered with maps, secret reports, and theological treatises. Upon it was a document, every stroke of his pen infused with the scent of blood and iron, an edict that was more than just a military plan. It was a sacred crusade, an act of divine retribution. This plan, conceived in his mind, stood apart from mere strategy. It was a holy intervention, a righteous crusade against heresy, an assault carried out under the auspices of divine justice. The target was England, an enterprise driven not solely by political or military motives, but by a profound, almost fanatical sense of religious vengeance. The air within the dimly lit chamber was thick, stale with the scent of wax, old paper, and iron, smelling of secrets and centuries of devotion. Outside the window stretched a bleak, lifeless landscape extending all the way to Guadalajara. Yet Philip's thoughts wandered far beyond these desolate plains, across turbulent waters of the Biscay Bay. He was dreaming of the north, of the island ruled by a woman he once could have called his wife, but who had become his sworn enemy. Elizabeth, the illegitimate daughter of a schismatic, the protector of pirates, a defiler of sacred altars, was her name. In his eyes, she was not a queen, but an Isabel, an embodiment of heresy and defiance, a personal insult to him, to the Catholic king, and to God himself. For years, Philip had endured her provocations, her pirate-infested waters raiding his treasure ships from the New World, her covert and overt support for rebellious Dutch Protestants fighting against his legitimate authority. He had tolerated her sly mockeries, her diplomatic evasions, her blatant insubordination, all in silence. Yet there was a limit to patience, and that limit was shattered by a series of events. The final straw was the execution of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, his last legitimate contender for the English throne, their claim to the crown intertwined with his own ambitions. Her death ignited the last embers of his restrained fury, transforming patience into rage. He believed divine wrath demanded retribution, and Philip resolved to become its instrument. Thus, from the shipyards of Lisbon, Cadiz, and Biscay, ships were being assembled, an unprecedented fleet never before seen by the Christian world. The greatest armada in history was taking shape, 130 formidable galleons, including the powerful Caraca, Urca, and Galleass ships, 29,000 of Spain's finest soldiers and sailors prepared for the assault, an overwhelming force. Thousands of cannons were mounted aboard. Their thunder promised to shake kingdoms. The fleet bore the papal blessing and was granted the indulgences promised by the Vatican, ensuring divine protection for all who participated in this sacred mission. This fleet was christened the Great and Most Fortunate Armada, a name that seemed to echo the confidence and pride of the Spanish realm. In Spain, doubts or fears about its invincibility had long been silenced. The mariners and soldiers believed fully in their unstoppable might. For them, this fleet was not just a military operation, it was a divine mission, a holy crusade, destined to reshape the balance of power and restore the honour of Christendom. This was no ordinary fleet simply sailing across the seas on their wooden vessels. It embodied the very heart of the Catholic faith, cast in bronze cannon and engraved into the hulls of the ships. It was a divine crusade, a formidable arm of God's wrath, aimed at crushing heresy and reaffirming religious supremacy. No one in the dark alleys of Escorial, nor in the bustling ports of Lisbon, nor even in the sun-drenched cities of Spain, could have imagined that this colossal force, this marvel of military engineering and naval prowess, was destined to become a symbol not of triumph, but of the greatest disaster in maritime history. Few could foresee that what seemed an invincible army would eventually become synonymous with humiliating defeat and catastrophic collapse. How did it come to this? How could the mightiest fleet ever assembled, born from pride and consecrated by faith, be humbled, shattered, and scattered by the cruel winds of fate? The answer to this question is complex and layered, rooted in decades of intrigue, ideological fanaticism, and the fierce collision of two worlds, two eras, two civilizations. This story is far more than just ships and cannons. It is about the people who built and fought these battles, driven by passions, mistaken in their judgments, bound by their unshakable beliefs. It is about the conflict between old traditions and new ideas, about one empire beginning its decline while another awakes to a bloody dawn. To truly grasp the depths of this tragedy, we must trace its origins back to the very beginning, the moment when the first seeds of this inevitable and furious conflict were sown. Before the thunder of cannons shattered the silence over the English Channel, a different tumult had already raged within people's hearts and minds. The confrontation between Spain and England was not merely a quarrel between two monarchs. It was a seismic rupture within the fabric of European civilization itself. This rupture's name was the Reformation. Understanding the fierce resolve of King Philip and the steadfastness of Queen Elizabeth requires a look even further back. It demands a glimpse into the generation prior to theirs, into a time when one king, animated by an obsessive desire for a male heir, unwittingly set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter his kingdom's destiny. During that era, as Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg's church, sparking a wave of religious upheaval that would split Christendom, England was ruled by a young, charismatic, initially devout monarch, Henry VII. Henry had authored a treatise defending the seven sacraments against Luther's teachings, earning the papal commendation of Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X. Ironically, history can wield a ruthless irony. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the very ones responsible for uniting Spain under a single crown, was a cornerstone of the Anglo-Spanish alliance. This union was not just political, but also deeply personal. Catherine had given Henry several children, yet only a daughter, Mary, survived. As years passed, the Queen aged, but the male heir remained elusive. For the Tudors, whose hold on the throne was precarious after the violent Wars of the Roses, the absence of a son was tantamount to a death sentence for their dynasty. It was then that she appeared, the fiery, dark-haired, sharp-eyed Anne Boleyn, a witty and well-educated lady-in-waiting trained at the French court. She was not a classical beauty, but she possessed a vitality and magnetism that the king found irresistible. Driven by passion and haunted by concerns over succession, Henry resolved to divorce Catherine and marry Anne at any cost, setting into motion a series of events that would forever alter the course of English history. After her husband's death, she turned to her father, Pope Clement VI, seeking a declaration that could annul her marriage on the grounds that Catherine had, in her past, been briefly married to her late elder brother, Arthur. According to the book of Leviticus, such a marriage was considered sinful, and thus her union with her brother-in-law would be an unlawful act. Yet the Pope faced an incredibly complex dilemma. Granting a divorce would mean affronting one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, Emperor Charles V, who happened to be not only the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, but also the military ruler who had recently sacked Rome, holding the Pope himself hostage. Denying the annulment risked provoking the wrath of this mighty emperor, an act that could jeopardize the Papal States and threaten the very survival of the Vatican. The Pope's refusal to support Henry's wish for a divorce ignited the king's fury, especially since Henry was advised by his reform-minded ministers Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Influenced by their revolutionary ideas, Henry embarked on an unprecedented course of action. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the king as the supreme head of the Church of England, not the Pope. This was not merely a divorce. This was a profound revolution that altered the religious and political landscape of the nation forever. Religious houses, monasteries, and abbeys that had stood for centuries as centres of spiritual life, learning, and great landowners were swiftly dissolved. Their immense wealth was seized by the crown, fueling the royal treasury. Simultaneously, the Bible was translated into English, making the sacred scripture accessible to ordinary people and diminishing the authority of the clergy. These sweeping reforms led England to break away from the authority of Rome, creating a distinctly English church, Anglican, a curious mixture of Catholic ritual and Protestant theology. This groundbreaking schism would eventually give rise to two future queens, half-sisters, who were destined to become mortal enemies. According to her mother's strict Catholic upbringing, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary, viewed the Reformation as the root of all her family's misfortunes. She saw the religious upheaval as heresy, an evil that shattered her family's unity and robbed her of her rightful claim to the throne. On the other hand, Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, was the embodiment of this new world. Her very right to exist and to ascend to the throne depended on the break with Rome. If Henry's marriage to Catherine was considered legitimate, then Elizabeth would be an illegitimate child, a bastard. After King Henry VII's death, his young son from his third marriage, Edward VI, assumed the throne. Under his reign, Protestant reforms accelerated further, and England progressively became a fully Protestant nation. Yet, Edward's rule was notably brief. His untimely death in 1553 ushered in the reign of Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. The entire country trembled under her rule. Queen Mary I, popularly known as Bloody Mary, was obsessively determined to restore England to the Catholic fold no matter the cost. Her regime was marked by brutal persecution of Protestants, with the fires of the Inquisition burning brightly across the land. Unsurpassed in the country's history, nearly 300 individuals, including Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, were burned alive for heresy, their screams echoing through the streets. To consolidate her authority and strengthen her Catholic cause, Mary made a decisive move that would have far-reaching consequences. She married her first cousin, Philip of Spain, the heir to the Spanish throne, who soon became her husband and king consort of England. Despite his royal title, Philip was indifferent to England, its people, and his youthful, ailing wife. He saw this union as a divine opportunity, a strategic alliance to bring England under the influence of Rome once more, and to establish Spanish dominance on the British Isles. However, the English people viewed this marriage with intense hostility, perceiving it as a threat to national independence that could turn their country into a Spanish possession. Mary's reign, therefore, was brief and marred by widespread discontent and unrest, ultimately ending in disappointment and tragedy. In the year 1558, she passed away, unable to bear the burden of childbirth, worn down by relentless illnesses and the painful realization that her life's mission had failed. On her deathbed, she was faced with the heartbreaking necessity of acknowledging as her heir someone she deeply despised and feared, her own sister, Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth who then stepped onto the stage of history, a figure destined to become one of the greatest monarchs ever to rule England. Her ascent to power was seen by Protestant factions as a moment of salvation, yet she inherited a nation scarred by religious hatred, its coffers empty, its army weak, and its enemies inexorably powerful, especially Spain and France. When she took the throne, she was only 25 years old. Her position was precarious, fragile, and fraught with danger. To Catholic Europe, she was considered an illegitimate heretic, born out of wedlock and having usurped a throne that was not rightfully hers. Initially, Philip II of Spain, now a widower, even extended an unsolicited proposal of marriage, hoping that a union with Elizabeth might allow him to retain influence over England through a peaceful alliance. Elizabeth, a master of diplomatic cunning, delayed her reply for years, ultimately refusing to marry, remaining famously known in history as the Virgin Queen. She understood all too well that tying herself to a foreign monarch through matrimony would strip her of independence, rendering her a mere pawn in European power struggles. Instead, she chose to institute what became known as the religious settlement in 1559, a move that proved to be a masterstroke of political pragmatism. This settlement re-established the Anglican Church as the official state church, with the monarch at its head, but deliberately kept its doctrines and practices vaguely defined. The purpose was clear: to create a religious environment broad enough to encompass both moderate Protestants and those still sympathetic to Catholicism. Elizabeth's aim was not to pry open personal faiths, but rather to stabilise her realm by averting deep religious divisions. The so-called middle way allowed her to maintain religious peace and internal order, yet it did not entirely resolve the underlying conflicts. Radical Protestants, or Puritans, pushed tirelessly for more profound reforms, seeking to purify the church further that Elizabeth carefully kept at bay. Meanwhile, Catholics, frequently stirred up from abroad, regarded her as a usurper and conspired against her throne, with their clandestine plots often orchestrated by her former father-in-law, Philip II, King of Spain. The religious discord grew into an open wound, a persistent, festering sore through which the poison of hatred and mistrust seeped relentlessly across the decades. This division eventually erupted into outright war, transforming a fractured nation into a battlefield of faith and loyalty. To grasp the full scope of the impending clash, one must closely examine the faces of the two contrasting antagonists, each a mirror of the other's fierce determination, yet embodying worlds of difference. They were like fire and ice, polar opposites in temperament and worldview, yet both possessed an unshakable will and a profound conviction that they fought for their own undeniable destinies. First, we turn to the man at the helm of Spain, Philip II of the Habsburg dynasty. Unlike his father, Emperor Charles V, Philip was not endowed with a warrior's spirit. He rarely left the confines of Spain and almost never led his armies in battle. His weapons were not sword or spear, but words and decree. He was a monarch bureaucrat, a veritable spider of statecraft, weaving a complex web of influence from his court at the Escorial. Philip personally scrutinized thousands of reports, meticulously issued edicts, and immersed himself in the minutiae of managing his vast empire. He was incredibly diligent, methodical, and patient, beginning each day with the dawn and working late into the night. This meticulousness, however, also revealed a darker flaw. The machinery of the Spanish government was astonishingly cumbersome and slow-moving. Critical decisions often languished for months, as the king painstakingly examined every detail of each document, every piece of counsel, before giving his approval. In his relentless pursuit of control, Philip's empire became a colossal yet sluggish monolith, its progress hindered by layers of bureaucracy and a painstakingly deliberate pace of governance. His dedication was undeniable, but this obsessive attention to detail came at a cost. The kingdom's ability to respond swiftly to crises was severely limited, often leaving vital matters unresolved for months, even years. Such inefficiency reflected both his strengths and limitations, shaping the course of his rule and ultimately influencing the tides of history that were about to surge forward. At the core of her personality lay a deep, almost fanatical devotion to her faith. She genuinely believed herself to be the chosen instrument of divine will, a sword wielded by the Catholic Church tasked with eradicating Protestant heresy across Europe. This conviction was not merely an outward pose or a calculated political stance. It formed the very fundament of her worldview. Whenever she faced setbacks, she refused to see them as personal errors, instead interpreting such failures as tests sent from God himself. Conversely, any victory she achieved was viewed as a sign of divine approval, reinforcing her unwavering belief in her divine mission. Her unshakable confidence in her moral righteousness made her extraordinarily stubborn, incapable of compromise on matters of faith or religious policy. Her empire was of truly colossal proportions. By the year 1680, it encompassed Spain and Portugal, which she unified in the year 1680, most of Italy, the affluent border regions known as the Franche-Comté, the Netherlands, and, of course, all her overseas territories scattered across the Americas and the Philippines. Silver streamed continuously from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas into Spain, fueling her vast empire's coffers and enabling an almost unstoppable display of power. Madrid stood as the financial hub of the entire world, a glittering centre of wealth and influence. The Spanish infantry, renowned as the tercios, was considered invincible and invulnerable in battle, a symbol of the unmatched military prowess of her realm. It seemed as though the might of Habsburg Spain knew no limits. Behind this dazzling facade, however, troubling issues simmered beneath the surface. Continuous warfare across Europe drained her treasury at a pace that even the inflow of New World silver could not match. Several times, Philip was forced to declare national bankruptcy, a clear sign of the fragility of his economic foundations. The Spanish economy was strangled by heavy taxes and soaring inflation, leading to stagnation and decline. Moreover, her empire was too vast and diverse, making cohesive governance an almost impossible task. Among the many problems, that of the Netherlands was the most painfully acute. In the wealthy, densely populated, and increasingly Protestant Dutch provinces, where Calvinism gained ground more rapidly with each passing year, Philip's inflexibility became painfully evident. His relentless efforts to suppress heresy through the Inquisition, coupled with attempts to quash the traditional privileges of Dutch nobility, sparked a protracted and bloody rebellion. This uprising, which would go down in history as the 1860 War, became a testing ground for military strategies on both sides and a relentless furnace in which England persistently stoked the flames, fueling the anger of the Spanish monarch with additional supplies of hostility and escalation. Across the English Channel, a different figure wielded authority. Elizabeth I, daughter of King Henry VII, was a ruler as commanding and charismatic as Philip, but also fiery and impulsive in her own right. Yet, the many years of political intrigue and the deadly threats she faced during her sister Mary's reign had tempered her, instilling a cautious, sometimes even duplicitous, approach to governance. She mastered the art of political chess, deftly weaving diplomacy, propaganda, and strategic alliances to secure her throne and her realm's stability. Elizabeth crafted around herself an almost sacred cult, depicting her as the Virgin Queen, betrothed not to a prince, but pledged solely to her people. She played expertly on her subjects' devotion and fears, manipulating emotions to foster loyalty and unity. Unlike Philip, her religious policy was pragmatic rather than dogmatic. Her primary goal was not to impose a particular faith, but to ensure stability and national cohesion in England, embracing a flexible approach that allowed her to navigate the turbulent waters of religious conflict. Highly educated and multilingual, she was passionate about music, dance, and the arts, cultivating a vibrant court life that thrived on cultural flourishing. Under her patronage, the genius of William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe blossomed, bringing forth new heights in literature and drama that would influence generations to come. Beneath the dazzling veneer of courtly splendour, however, Elizabeth possessed a sharp, calculating mind. She was remarkably parsimonious, a trait that frequently drove her ministers to despair, but ultimately saved her kingdom from financial ruin, preventing the looming threat of bankruptcy that had plagued many other European monarchs of her era. In sum, while her court was a beacon of arts and culture, Elizabeth's astute political manoeuvring and prudence ensured the survival and stability of her reign. Her leadership balanced a delicate mixture of boldness and caution, enabling England to emerge as a formidable, united nation, ready to face the turbulent challenges of her time. She had a remarkable talent for selecting capable advisors, individuals such as the wise William Cecil, the ambitious Lord Burleigh, and Francis Walsingham, the head of her espionage network. More importantly, she possessed an exceptional ability to listen to their counsel, although the final decisions invariably remained in her own hands. Her England was a small, modest country situated on the periphery of Europe, with a population of around 4 million people compared to Spain's 10 million. Its economy was fragile and significantly less prosperous than Spain's, and its military forces were weak, inexperienced, and ill-equipped. The only real strength of England lay in its formidable navy and its insular geography. Queen Elizabeth understood all too well that in a direct confrontation with Spain, her country stood no chance of victory. Consequently, her foreign policy was built around a strategy of relentless, small-scale strikes, what might be called a war of 1,000 tiny pricks. She chose to fight through proxies, secretly financing Dutch insurgents and French Huguenots, thereby avoiding open conflict. At times, she turned a blind eye, or even openly encouraged, those who operated her naval dogs, her ships and sailors conducting strikes and raids against Spanish interests abroad. It is also at this juncture that we encounter one of the most pivotal figures in our story, a man whom the Spanish vilified as the embodiment of the devil, yet who was celebrated as a national hero in England. His name was Sir Francis Drake, a man born from humble beginnings, the son of a Protestant farmer. His extraordinary life was marked by boldness, daring, and ruthless pursuit. Drake hated the Spanish with fervent passion, viewing them as enemies both of his faith and his homeland. He was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, a voyage that spanned from the year 1579 through 1580. But his journey was not a mere scientific expedition. It was a grand pirate raid orchestrated against Spain's Pacific coast, where he found no friends, only enemies. During this voyage, he captured the renowned silver train on the Peruvian route across the Panamanian Isthmus and seized a treasure-laden galleon, a floater packed with wealth from South America. When he returned to England, the treasure he amassed was more than double the annual revenue of the entire English crown at the time. Elizabeth, who received her fair share of the spoils, publicly knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind, in a grand ceremony that became an act of symbolic defiance. For Philip II of Spain, this was an unforgivable insult. An English pirate, who had been raiding his possessions and disrupting his empire, was now officially a knight and a hero in England. For decades, these two monarchs, Elizabeth and Philip, engaged in a complicated game of political chess across the European continent. Elizabeth used a mix of diplomacy, false promises, and deception. She skillfully delayed and evaded the inevitable confrontation. Meanwhile, Philip II endured, nurturing his grievances, waiting for an opportune moment to strike. Yet, events steadily pushed toward the climax. England's support for Dutch rebels and pirates became increasingly explicit, with English privateers boldly attacking Spanish shipping and colonies. The last straw, as widely recognised, was the execution of Mary Stuart in 1587, a Catholic queen whose claim to the English throne Philip II had supported. Her death provided him with not only a reason, but a formal justification to invade England. What was once a distant and vaguely conceived plan soon became an urgent, pressing task. King Philip II promised a staggering reward of 1 million ducats to anyone who would see the first Spanish soldier set foot on English soil. The wheel of history had begun to turn irresistibly, making it impossible to halt. Once the decision for invasion was made, activity across the Spanish Empire intensified to unprecedented levels. Philip's grand scheme grew in scope and audacity. His ambition was no longer merely to defeat the English navy, but to crush the very heart of Elizabeth's realm. The meticulously crafted plan, devised by Spain's foremost admiral, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, consisted of two integral parts that had to operate in perfect harmony, much like the intricate workings of a finely tuned timepiece. The first part involved the Grand Armada itself, a colossal fleet assembled from the ports of Lisbon, Cadiz, and La Rochelle. Its primary mission was not to engage in a decisive naval battle on the open sea with the formidable English fleet, but rather to reach the narrow Strait of Dover, establish dominance over it, and transform into an impregnable shield protecting the Spanish and Allied forces. The second, perhaps even more crucial component of the strategy was centred in Flanders. There, in the Netherlands, a seasoned army under the command of the renowned general of his era, Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma, was stationed. This formidable force, consisting of around 30,000 battle-hardened veterans drawn from Spanish, Italian, German, and Walloon soldiers, was to be assembled at the ports of Dunkirk and Newport. They would then be transported across the Channel using specially prepared landing craft, designed for the critical operation ahead. The essence of the plan lay in the Armada's entry into the Dover Strait. where it was to join forces with Farnese's fleet, acting as an escort and shield, safeguarding their passage from potential British attacks. The ultimate objective was to secure a safe crossing and facilitate the disembarkation of the army onto the Kent coast. Once the troops of Parma successfully established a foothold on British soil, especially in Kent, it was believed that the outcome of the entire conflict would be predetermined. The victory was almost within their grasp. Queen Elizabeth's England lacked a regular standing army capable of mounting a serious resistance against the seasoned tercios of Spain. Her militias, poorly trained and lightly armed, were no match for the Spanish forces. The plan on paper appeared bold and strategically sound, yet, like many ambitious schemes, it harboured several critical flaws that, at the time, seemed insignificant but would prove disastrous later. Preparations for the operation began in earnest. The shipyards buzzed with the relentless sounds of axes striking wood. In the foundries, hundreds of bronze cannons were cast, ready to equip the fleet. Across the entire realm, a vast logistical effort was underway, provisioning armies with tons of salted beef and pork, countless biscuits, dry rations, buckets of wine and water. It was a colossal logistical operation on an unprecedented scale, but from the outset it faced a series of setbacks. The first blow came from Francis Drake, a daring English privateer. During the height of preparations, Drake led a small squadron directly into the harbour of Cadiz, the chief port of the Armada. There, he set fire to and sank more than 30 Spanish vessels, halting the fleet's assembly for over a year. In a mocking gesture, Drake dubbed his raid setting fire to the beard of the Spanish king. Though the attack didn't prevent the overall plans, it inflicted significant delays, disrupting months of meticulous preparations. More critically, Drake's raid destroyed a substantial portion of the wooden staves used for making barrels, essential containers for food, water, and ammunition. The Spaniards had to hurriedly produce new barrels from raw, unseasoned wood, a decision that would bring disastrous consequences later. In the course of their voyage, these replacement barrels dried out and warped, leading to leaks. Water, wine, and other supplies spoiled inside, causing widespread illness among the crews and weakening their strength. The second, perhaps even more devastating setback was the death of the fleet's commander. In February of the year 1588, the Marquis of Santa Cruz passed away. He was considered the most capable and experienced naval commander Spain had ever known, resolute, commanding, and wielding unwavering authority. His leadership was the heartbeat of the entire enterprise. With his sudden departure, King Philip II faced an urgent need to find a suitable successor. The choice fell on a man whose very nature was the stark opposite of Santa Cruz, Don Alonso Perez de Guzman, Duke of Medina Sidonia. The Duke was among the most noble and wealthy aristocrats in Spain, a man renowned for his administrative skills, honesty, piety, and unwavering loyalty to the king. Although lacking the extensive naval experience of his predecessor, he was entrusted with leading what could best be described as a monumental and perilous undertaking, one that required both political influence and a capacity for resilient leadership under tremendous pressure. One significant flaw marked his character from the very start. Unlike seasoned sailors, he lacked any real maritime experience. He had never commanded a fleet in combat, suffered from seasickness, and was fully aware of his own incompetence. Upon receiving his appointment to this commanding position, he hastily penned a desperate letter to the king, pleading to be released from the burden of such responsibility. In his letter, he confessed that he possessed neither the experience nor the skills required for such a colossal undertaking. He honestly admitted that he had no physical stamina for the rigours of the sea, nor any understanding of maritime tactics, ports, or the ways to defend against them. He confessed ignorance of naval manoeuvres, of the English ports along the coast, and of the methods necessary to oppose a formidable enemy fleet. Despite all this, King Philip remained firm and resolute. For him, nobility and unwavering loyalty to the Duke mattered more than prior military experience at sea. He believed that the Duke was a competent organizer, confident that in battle, seasoned admirals like Juan Martinez de Recalde and Miguel de Oquendo would ensure victory. This decision proved to be disastrous. The fleet, painstakingly assembled through immense effort, was a motley and visually intimidating sight. It consisted of a diverse assortment of ships, powerful warships, Portuguese and Spanish galleons, heavy freight vessels, originally cargo ships from Urk, repurposed for military use, and even Mediterranean feluccas with rows of oars. Altogether, the fleet comprised nearly 130 ships. They carried almost 2,500 cannons, but this very fact concealed a grave problem. The Spanish naval tactics, refined during Mediterranean battles against the Turks, relied heavily on boarding combat. Ships were regarded as floating fortresses and platforms for transporting infantry. Their primary goal was to close in on the enemy, unleash 1 or 2 artillery volleys to suppress the opposing crew, and then board the enemy vessel, where the renowned Spanish infantry would decide the outcome. Consequently, Spanish ships were tall, with heavy superstructures, castles at the bow and stern, features that made them poorly manoeuvrable in the wind. Their artillery was predominantly composed of heavy, short-barreled guns designed for close-range fire. Loading these guns was slow, and their artillery crews were often soldiers assigned temporarily to operate the cannons, rather than experienced naval gunners. Meanwhile, while the Spanish prepared their formidable battering ram, on the other side of the English Channel, a different, lighter, yet no less deadly weapon was taking shape. Thanks to its extensive spy network under the management of Francis Walsingham, England was thoroughly informed of Philip's plans. Rumours of an impending invasion spread quickly across the country, causing widespread agitation. Queen Elizabeth, despite her legendary frugality, was compelled to allocate funds for strengthening the nation's defences. A system of signal beacons was established along the southern coast, ready to be lit instantly to relay news of the enemy's approach. Volunteer militias were being assembled, but Britain's most crucial asset remained its navy. The English fleet embodied a completely different naval philosophy. Several decades prior to these events, a man named John Hawkins, a notorious seafarer, slave trader, and pirate, had enacted a true revolution in shipbuilding design. He understood that future battles would be decided by artillery duels at a distance, not by close quarters boarding actions. Instead of constructing the high, bulky ships reminiscent of the Spanish model, the English began creating what came to be known as racing galleons, sleek, fast vessels designed for agility rather than brute size. These ships were lower in profile than the Spanish vessels, yet they also boasted greater length. Their decks were sleek and smooth, free from the cumbersome structures that cluttered traditional ships, enabling them to achieve significantly higher speeds and greater maneuverability, especially when sailing against the wind. This design allowed them to sail closer to the wind, granting their crews a vital tactical advantage in naval engagements. However, their most notable strength lay in their artillery. The English fleet did not view their ships primarily as transports for soldiers, but rather as highly specialised platforms dedicated mainly to artillery. The English strategists placed a heavy emphasis on long-range, long-barreled cannons, culverins and demi-culverins, that could strike effectively from a distance. Unlike the heavy Spanish guns, which were intended to batter ship hulls for boarding actions, The English culverins were designed to inflict damage from afar, targeting ships like Rangoed, the enemy's sails, and their crews from a safe distance. Moreover, these English artillery pieces were cast from a more affordable yet high-quality cast iron and mounted on compact, four-wheeled gun carriages. At first glance, this might seem like a minor technical detail, but in practice, it provided a colossal advantage. After firing, the guns could be quickly and easily rolled back inward onto the deck for reloading, significantly increasing their rate of fire. In contrast, the Spanish guns were mounted on bulky, two-wheeled carriages, similar to field artillery, which made reloading a time-consuming and arduous process. As a result, the English ships could fire 2 to 3 times more shots in the same period, greatly outpacing the Spanish in rate of fire. The English gunners were all highly trained professionals, seasoned sailors who had honed their skills over years of practice in rapid, precise targeting. Leading this fleet was Lord Charles Howard, a cousin of Queen Elizabeth. Like Medina Sidonia, he was an aristocrat, but unlike his Spanish counterpart, he had considerable combat experience at sea. His vice admirals were among the most hardened maritime veterans, men who had battled in dozens of pirate raids and naval clashes. Among them were Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher, men who knew every secret, every inlet and current of the Channel intimately. They were not afraid of the Spanish. On the contrary, they yearned for battle, seeing it not just as a means to defend their homeland, but also as an opportunity to seize rich loot. The English fleet comprised roughly 200 vessels. However, most of these were small, hastily armed merchant ships converted into warcraft for the occasion. The core of the fleet consisted of about 34 royal ships, those modern, swift galleons, the latest and fastest in English service. Although their total tonnage and crew count was significantly less than that of the Spanish Armada, the English fleet excelled in manoeuvrability, speed, range, and rate of fire, attributes that mattered most in combat. By the summer of 1758, the two opposing sides along the Channel had assembled two radically different military machines, each born from contrasting strategic visions. The Spanish Armada was a sluggish, yet formidable fleet, more of a land force afloat, relying on close quarters boarding combat. In contrast, the English Navy was swift, agile, and focused on long-range artillery battles. The outcome of their confrontation was far from predetermined. It would hinge on the weather, luck, and the effectiveness of each side's tactics under the harsh conditions of the Channel. A final assessment of Philip's plan uncovered another critical weakness, one that no one at the time seemed to take seriously. The Duchy of Parma, situated in Dunkerque, lacked a true deep-water port, capable of accommodating large vessels at any time. His disembarking barges could only venture into the sea during high tide, which posed a significant logistical hurdle. The Duke could not simply load his entire army beforehand and wait at sea for the arrival of the Armada in open waters. Instead, the fleet had to stay anchored just off the unprotected coast of Flanders, remaining vulnerable to potential attack while waiting for the siege to begin. This meant that the entire Spanish invasion fleet was exposed to constant danger. It was an inherently fragile and perilous arrangement. Coordination between Medina Sidonia's fleet and the Parma army relied on swift, light courier vessels. These small ships had to deliver messages across great distances, often taking days to reach their destination. As a result, managing the movements and positioning of two massive forces separated by the sea with the limited technological capabilities of the 15th century was an almost impossible task. Despite these grim logistical realities, those in Espadanya or Escorial paid little attention to such details. Their unwavering faith in divine providence and the sense that their mission was divinely ordained overshadowed practical concerns. In late May of 1658, after a solemn prayer service and receiving a divine blessing, the great and most fortunate Armada set sail from Lisbon. The sight was truly breathtaking. Hundreds of ships, their lofty sails emblazoned with the Red Cross, began their slow but determined departure. The masts bore banners depicting the Virgin Mary, inspiring both awe and religious fervour in all who beheld them. The sounds of drums, the thunder of cannon fire, and the bursts of celebratory salutes echoed across the harbour, creating an atmosphere that seemed to herald the very might of Catholic Spain amid a rising tide of national pride. For a moment, it appeared as though the overwhelming power of the Spanish monarchy and its divine favour had come alive in that formidable fleet poised for war. Yet, almost immediately, divine favour appeared to falter. The divine protection that Philip so heavily relied upon began to show signs of fragility. No sooner had the ships crossed the Atlantic than they were struck by a violent storm, an unrelenting hurricane that tore through the sailing squadron. For weeks, the ships fought fiercely against fierce winds and monstrous waves that battered their hulls and decks. The inferior quality of their barrels, meant for storage but not for enduring such conditions, began to take its toll. Drinking water spoilt quickly, contaminating the sailors' supplies, while provisions dampened and spoiled, accelerating the spread of illness and disease among the crew. The fleet became scattered and disorganized, with ships drifting far apart, separated by the tumult of the storm. It was only with great difficulty that Medina Sidonia managed to gather the scattered vessels together. They sought refuge at the port of La Coruña, located in the northern part of Spain, where repairs could be effected and supplies replenished. Already at this early stage of the campaign, morale among the sailors and officers started to decline markedly. The Duke, exhausted by seasickness and witnessing the dire state of his fleet, found it increasingly difficult to maintain confidence. He felt compelled to write to King Philip, honestly reporting the worsening conditions and suggesting that perhaps the enterprise should be reconsidered. The letter detailed how the weather had turned unfavourable, supplies were decaying, crews falling ill, and how he feared that the invasion, which was supposed to serve the glory of God, was losing its Holy Spirit and becoming a burden rather than a divine mission. King Philip's response was cold and resolute. He commanded Medina Sidonia to continue pressing forward, emphasizing that he had been sent to confront men, not the elements. The king insisted that divine intervention would turn the tides of weather in their favour if it was truly God's will, and that the fleet must persevere regardless of the storms. Faced with no practical options, and under the king's stern command, the fleet resumed its voyage after nearly a month of repairs, setting sail again on the 21st of July in 1658. Meanwhile, across the Channel in England, an atmosphere of tense anticipation prevailed. The English fleet had gathered in Plymouth, ready to face the approaching invasion. One famous legend recounts that Sir Francis Drake, upon receiving news of the approaching armada, was leisurely playing a game of bowls on the shore. He supposedly told his gunners to finish their game before readying for battle, implying that they still had enough time to prepare defences, and perhaps even to defeat the Spaniards. Though this story is likely an invention or exaggeration, it vividly captures the calm, composed confidence of the English naval commanders, an air of quiet assurance that their fleet stood ready to challenge the mighty Spaniards at a moment's notice. On the evening of the 29th of July, 1758, a lookout from one of the English ships spotted a dark mass on the horizon, the approaching fleet, with hundreds of masts silhouetted against the evening sky. As the armada entered the English Channel, signal fires blazed along the coast. relaying warnings from hill to hill and from town to town, alerting everyone to the arrival of the Spanish invasion force. This was a carefully orchestrated effort to alert and mobilise local defences. Once the fleet was fully visible, the English commanders observed the formation, a massive crescent-shaped assembly of ships. The cleverest element of their strategy was this arrangement. The most vulnerable transport vessels were placed at the centre of the crescent, flanked and protected by the most formidable warships and heavy galleons positioned at the edges and rear. This formation was a masterstroke of naval defence, an enormous semicircular barricade designed to keep the Spaniards at bay while minimising their exposure to attack. From this vantage point, the English launched a fierce defence, confident that their strategic positioning and superior manoeuvrability would eventually turn the tide of the battle. The horns of this crescent-shaped formation were fully prepared to close in, ready to ensnare any English ship daring enough to drift too close. The structure of this fleet seemed impenetrable, almost cast in stone, a seemingly invincible wall of ships. When the English fleet set sail from Plymouth, they found themselves in a disadvantageous position, fighting against the wind and trailing behind the Spanish Armada. However, under cover of night and utilising their knowledge of local currents, the English managed to manoeuvre around the fleet and occupy a vantage point windward of their opponents. This tactical advantage granted them the initiative, allowing them to choose when to attack and when to retreat, a crucial element in naval warfare. What followed was a grueling game of cat and mouse that stretched over a relentless 7 days. Their first encounter occurred on the 31st of July, near Plymouth. True to their strategic approach, the English did not rush to close the distance. Instead, they kept at a safe yet effective range, firing their culverin cannons at the Spanish ships, specifically aiming at the masts and sails in an effort to hinder their manoeuvrability. The Spanish responded with their heavy cannon fire, but most of their massive projectiles either failed to reach the more agile English vessels or missed entirely, flying past without impact. For the Spanish admirals, who were accustomed to fierce, close-quarters boarding actions, such a tactic was perplexing and somewhat humiliating. They attempted to provoke the English into an engagement at close range, hoping that a more direct confrontation would turn the tide. Yet, the English fleet moved with the patience of hounds circling a bear, sharp, persistent, biting at the beast, but never allowing themselves to be caught in a trap. On the very same day, misfortune befell both sides. 2 separate accidents struck the Spanish fleet, severely diminishing their combat effectiveness. On the flagship of the Andalusian squadron, commanded by Don Rosario, a collision caused the loss of a mast, forcing the vessel to fall behind the others. In a bid to preserve formation, Medina Sidonia was compelled to abandon this ship, which was subsequently seized by Drake along with its entire treasure cargo the following day. Almost simultaneously, another of their main galleons, the San Salvador, suffered a catastrophic explosion in its powder magazine, destroying the vessel's stern section entirely. Its crew was forced to abandon the ship as well. Thus, without engaging in any substantial combat, the Spanish fleet suffered the loss of 2 of its best ships. The fighting continued near Portland on the 2nd of August and off the coast of the Isle of Wight on the 4th of August. The pattern was the same. The English inflicted some damage with long-range fire, but were unable to breach the thick oak sides of the galleons. The Spanish, in turn, desperately attempted to engage in boarding actions, to bring the battle to close quarters. Yet, slowly but surely, the fleet was drifting eastward, moving up the strait, while the English fleet remained close behind, shadowing their movements. Although the English did not succeed in sinking a single Spanish vessel, their tactical approach was proving effective. The Spaniards began to run low on heavy shot for their long-range cannons, and more critically, their gunpowder supplies, which were essential for maintaining their firepower, were nearing exhaustion. Morale among the Spanish sailors was rapidly declining. The constant state of tension, combined with the stress of sleepless nights and the ongoing threat, was taking a toll. Finally, on the 6th of August, the Spanish Armada reached what seemed to be its final staging point, the port of Calais. There it anchored, awaiting dispatches from the Duke of Parma. The commander of the fleet, Medina Sidonia, hurriedly sent a messenger to Parma, informing him that the fleet was in position and ready for the invasion. However, this turn of events revealed a catastrophic flaw in their plan. The response from Parma, received a day later, was shocking. It stated that his forces were not yet prepared and would require at least 6 more days to transport his troops across the Channel. Moreover, he explained that he could not leave Dunkirk, as Dutch lighter ships and coastal defences continued to blockade the harbour. Consequently, the Spanish fleet found itself caught in a desperate trap. It was anchored off the open coast, with its broadside exposed to both the relentless English fire and the prevailing westerly winds. Its ships became sitting targets, vulnerable to attack, unable to move or reposition, effectively contained and immobilized. The situation had turned into a standoff that threatened to prolong indefinitely, with the Spanish fleet stranded in a precarious position, struggling to fulfill their grand invasion plan amid mounting obstacles and diminishing resources. The English understood perfectly well the extraordinary opportunity that had suddenly fallen into their hands, and they acted swiftly to seize it. On the night spanning from the 7th to the 8th of August, they launched their most devastating assault. Under the cover of darkness, the British fleet quietly lowered their sails and let the tide carry them forward, unleashing a formidable armada composed of 8 fireships, old vessels heavily laden with flammable materials such as tar, gunpowder, and other combustible substances. These vessels, ancient yet deadly weapons, were designed specifically to cause chaos and destruction. The Spanish, whose ancestors had faced the Ottoman Turks in previous campaigns, knew very well what fireships could do. Memories of the siege of Antwerp, where similar incendiary vessels had wrought incredible damage, were still fresh in their minds. When the lookouts spotted the approaching blaze and ominous glow of the burning ships, chaos broke out among the Spanish fleet. The sailors, imagining how the flaming craft would crash into their densely packed ranks, setting one ship ablaze after another, responded with panic. Amidst the darkness and the tumult, the Spanish captains issued the only possible command, under the circumstances, to cut the anchor cables and attempt to flee into open sea. Yet, in the confusion and darkness, ships began colliding with each other, disrupting the carefully arranged formation. The once formidable crescent-shaped battle array of the Royal Armada, its seemingly unbreakable defences built over an entire week, was shattered in an instant. By dawn, the fleet was scattered along the coastline, a total disaster. Medina Sidonia, striving to restore some semblance of order, realised it was already too late. The English had thwarted his efforts completely. The morning of the 8th of August marked the onset of a decisive battle near the Flemish town of Gravelines. The changing weather played into the English hands. A gusting northwesterly wind pushed the Spanish ships onto dangerous shoals along the Flemish coast. Enabled by their superior speed and manoeuvrability, the English forces daringly engaged in close-range combat for the first time during this campaign. But this close fight was a different kind of engagement for the English. They approached the Spanish galleons from the windward side at a distance of 50 to 100 metres, unleashing devastating broadsides with all their cannons, and then swiftly withdrew to reload. This tactic left the Spanish vessels almost wholly defenceless. Their slow-loading guns were unable to counterattack effectively, and the sailors prepared for boarding action stood helplessly on decks swept by a storm of cannonballs and shrapnel. What was unfolding was no longer a mere exchange of fire. It resembled a brutal slaughter. English shot shattered the Spanish shipboards, brought down masts, and mowed down their crews. The decks of the Spanish vessels were soaked in blood, turning into scenes of chaos and horror. The battle at Gravelines endured for 8 long hours, during which the Spanish fought with desperate courage. Some ships, such as the flagship San Martin, and even the Medinan flagship named the Celion, as well as the San Mateo, managed to withstand the relentless barrage of dozens of English vessels. Though battered and riddled with damage, they refused to surrender their banners. By the end of the day, both sides faced a critical shortage of gunpowder. The Spanish had lost about 5 ships sunk or stranded on the shoals, while many others had been critically damaged beyond repair. The human toll was staggering. Thousands of sailors from both sides had fallen in the fighting. Despite their losses, the English forces had not lost a single vessel, and their casualties in men were kept to a minimum. However, the true significance of this battle was not confined to the numbers or ships lost. The morale of the Spanish Armada was shattered. Its once seemingly invincible order was broken. The fleet was driven back from the coast of Flanders, its formation lost, and the pathway for a planned connection with the Duke of Parma's troops was cut off forever. Then, as if nature itself decided the outcome, the weather shifted once again. A strong northwesterly wind arose, intensifying rapidly, and began to drive the remnants of the Spanish fleet into the North Sea. Medina Sidonia found himself faced with a stark choice: either be driven onto the treacherous sands of Zealand, or attempt to escape by sailing northward, around Scotland and Ireland, hoping to return to Spain. This turn of events left him with no safe options but to make a perilous retreat into the open waters of the North Atlantic. The English fleet faced failure, yet the most harrowing trials for the Armada lay still ahead. Their journey back across the Atlantic turned into a harrowing ordeal, a relentless agony of endurance. For 2 more days, the English ships relentlessly hunted the remnants of the Armada, but once they exhausted their last reserves of gunpowder and provisions, they had no choice but to retreat, abandoning the pursuit. Now, the Spaniards found themselves alone, confronting the most ruthless adversary of all, the merciless North Atlantic and its violent storms. The battered ships were in a deplorable state. Many were barely afloat, their hulls riddled with breaches, their sails ripped apart, and masts shattered. On board, supplies of fresh water and food had run dangerously low, leading to brutal hunger and the onset of scurvy. Hundreds of wounded soldiers lay dying without proper medical aid, their suffering amplified by the relentless cold and the chaos surrounding them. Yet, perhaps, the most frightening obstacle was the lack of accurate navigation charts, crucial for these treacherous northern waters. The fleet moved almost blindly, guided only by limited knowledge and instinct, drifting in a vast, unforgiving sea. When the ships rounded the coast of Scotland and entered the open Atlantic, they were abruptly caught in autumnal storms. Storms that year were extraordinarily fierce, unlike any previously recorded. The English later described these gales as Protestant winds, interpreting them as divine signs of divine wrath or punishment. Towering waves crashed down upon the ships, tossing them like mere splinters. The most vulnerable vessels, already damaged and exhausted, fell behind and disappeared into the raging sea. The fate of those ships was especially tragic when storms carried them towards Ireland's western coast, a rugged and unforgiving landscape strewn with perilous reefs. There, approximately 2 Spanish galleons were shattered to pieces amid the deafening chaos of the storm. The scenes of destruction resembled apocalyptic visions. Enormous vessels were hurled against the jagged rocks, where they disintegrated within moments, broken apart by the relentless surf. Hundreds of crew members drowned while desperately trying to reach the icy shoreline. For those fortunate enough to survive and reach land, an even grimmer ordeal awaited. Ireland at that time was essentially under English occupation. The English were engaged in a brutal conflict with local clans and tribes. The English governor issued ruthless orders. All Spaniards found ashore would be regarded as pirates or rebels and executed accordingly. A deadly hunt for survivors ensued, pursued, captured, and exterminated without mercy. Only a few managed to find refuge with Irish chieftains who harboured deep hatred for the English oppressors. These lucky souls, after long and arduous wanderings, finally managed to return to their homeland, bearing harrowing tales of the ordeal they endured. By the end of September, the first battered ships and their battered crews began arriving at northern ports of Spain. The scene was pitiable. Out of a fleet of roughly 130 ships that set sail from Lisbon, barely more than 60 returned. Of the 29,000 sailors and soldiers who had embarked on the expedition, approximately 10,000 survived. Most of these survivors were gravely ill and physically exhausted, many dying right in the ports upon touching their native land, the cold reality of loss and suffering pressing down upon them. Spain was overcome with grief and mourning. When Philip II received news of the catastrophe from his secluded residence on Ischia, witnesses report that he showed no outward emotion. His only quiet remark was that he had sent ships to fight against men, not to go against divine wrath. He ordered aid to be provided to the survivors and mandated prayer services of thanksgiving for those who had been spared. His steadfast faith remained unshaken. In his view, the failure was not a matter of his own culpability, but a sign of the inscrutable will of the Almighty, whose ways are beyond human understanding. So then, why did the invincible Armada suffer such a devastating defeat? Throughout the centuries, historians have endlessly debated the true causes behind this pivotal event. There was no single decisive factor at play. Rather, it was a complex confluence of multiple elements that culminated in the catastrophe. It was a deadly mix of strategic miscalculations, tactical blunders, technological shortfalls, and, unquestionably, the cruel and unpredictable weather conditions that played a significant role. At the outset, the very plan for the expedition was fundamentally flawed. The ambitious idea of coordinating two immense naval and land forces, separated by the vast expanse of the sea, without a reliable communication system, was essentially a reckless gamble. The absence of a deep water port at Palma made the entire operation heavily dependent on sheer luck and the whims of the weather, adding an element of chaos and uncertainty to an already risky venture. Furthermore, a crucial and tragic error was made at the leadership level. The appointment of the inexperienced Medina Sidonia as commander proved to be a monumental mistake, even if the Duke himself did everything within his power to fulfill his duties. His lack of experience and preparedness in commanding such an enormous fleet significantly contributed to the chaos that ensued. In addition to these strategic flaws, the technological and tactical advantages held by the English Navy became unavoidable factors. English ships outpaced the Spanish vessels in speed and maneuverability, giving them a clear edge. Their long-range, rapid-firing artillery proved vastly more effective in the confined waters of the English Channel than the Spanish reliance on close-quarters boarding tactics. The English Navy relentlessly imposed their preferred style of combat, to which the Spanish fleet simply was not adapted or prepared. Another critical factor that cannot be underestimated was the weather itself. It was the storms that battered the Spanish Armada during its retreat, specifically the destructive gales encountered in Calais and around the Gravelines that shattered the fleet strategically. While the tactical defeat was achieved in battle, the more devastating losses came from the tempestuous storms that scattered and sank numerous ships on their way back. These violent winds, ominously dubbed Protestant winds by some, indeed played a decisive role in turning a tactical setback into a catastrophic loss. Finally, this event reflected a clash of two worlds, two very different visions of empire and governance. On one side stood the cumbersome, rigid, dogmatic Spanish Empire under Philip II, confident in its divine right to rule and its unquestioned authority. On the other side was England, under Elizabeth I, dynamic, flexible, pragmatic, where innovation and initiative were valued more than noble lineage or tradition. In this sense, the defeat of the Armada was not just a military failure, but a symbolic turning point, heralding a new era. The consequences of this defeat reverberated far beyond the battlefield. For England, it was a moment of national triumph, an event that fostered immense pride, solidified the Protestant identity, and bolstered Queen Elizabeth's authority. This victory entered the collective consciousness as a legendary story of David triumphing over Goliath, a symbol of hope and rightful resistance. It paved the way for English sailors and merchants to venture into the global oceans, initiating a slow yet steady ascent towards maritime dominance and the eventual creation of the vast British Empire. Conversely, for Spain, this was a brutal blow to both its prestige and its morale. The myth of Spanish invincibility was shattered, revealing vulnerabilities that had once been kept under tight control. Although Spain remained a major world power for about a century afterward, the defeat marked the beginning of its long, difficult decline. The ongoing war with England continued until both Philip and Elizabeth passed away, draining the coffers and sapping the strength of both nations. Yet, Spain never fully recovered from this humiliating setback, and the image of an unstoppable empire faded gradually into history. The story of the Armada serves as a perennial reminder of the perils of arrogance and overconfidence. It teaches that faith in one's own infallibility can often lead to disaster. In warfare, as in life, victory depends not only on strength and might, but also on adaptability, intelligence, technological innovation, and sometimes on the capriciousness of the wind. The sombre stone walls of Escorial still silently bear witness to the shattered hopes of a secluded king, while the winds sweeping over the narrow sea and the Irish cliffs continue to whisper mournful tales of hundreds of ships lost and thousands of lives claimed by the sea, sacrificed in the name of faith and imperial ambitions. The great and most fortunate fleet has now been forever etched into history, earning its place as an indomitable force. However, the recognition it holds is not in the sense its creators originally intended, but as a perpetual symbol of one of the most profound and defining defeats the world has ever witnessed. It stands as an everlasting reminder that even the mightiest armadas can be humbled, and that triumph and failure are often two sides of the same coin. Thank you for spending this time with us, during which you ventured into one of the most dramatic and pivotal chapters of global history. This journey into the past offers a glimpse into the tumult and grandeur that have shaped civilizations and altered the course of humanity. If this exploration resonated with you and sparked your interest, we invite you to continue following such narratives, to share your thoughts through comments, and to disseminate this story further. Ahead, we face a future riddled with enigmas, monumental achievements, and tragic events. all elements that have played crucial roles in moulding the world as we know it today. These remnants of the past serve as silent witnesses to our ongoing quest for understanding, and each story brings us closer to grasping the true nature of our collective history. Until we meet again, stay curious and attentive to the stories that history quietly whispers to us across the ages.